Mr. President, when we talk about national security issues and the vulnerabilities that we have as a nation, I can think of no other area where we face such challenges and yet such opportunities as when it comes to our energy assets and how we can utilize our energy policies in the intersect with national security. The United States' inability to export oil is a vulnerability to us as a nation. At a time when we have risen to be the world's top producer of oil, our outdated 1970s era ban on oil exports is causing us to miss out on a significant energy, economic, and security-related field of benefits. And, Mr. President, the good news is that we can change this. It's within our power to change that, and that's why I've come to the floor this afternoon. Here's a fact. The United States is the only advanced nation that prohibits crude oil exports. We're the only one. You have countries like Australia, Denmark, Norway, the United Kingdom, Canada, even New Zealand, all allow for both imports and exports, just like the normal trade in any other commodity. I look at it, and it's distinctly weird that we would prohibit our own exports here. We're also in a position where our friends and our trading partners are openly asking us for assistance. They're coming to us and saying, hey, can you help? We're your friends, we're your allies, you have the resource. Mr. President, the world has changed dramatically. We've got new alliances, we have new threats, we have new hopes, we've got new fears, and it's my own hope that while the world may have changed, our nation's role as a global leader has not eroded, and I think this is an area where we have an opportunity to prove that it has not eroded. Our energy renaissance is a new thing, and I think sometimes it takes time to understand the implication of new things, of changes. But here's where we've been. We have already held about a half dozen hearings on the topic of oil exports in the House and in the Senate since just last January. I introduced this subject last January 2014, and I said at that time that 2014 was going to be the year of the report, where we would seek out the experts. We would ask the think tanks to weigh in on this issue. And so they did. And the reports that came out were numerous, they were considered, they were thoughtful, and they were all very, very helpful. Reports coming out of the Brookings Institution, the Columbia University, the Center for New American Security, too many to even list here. But the individual experts who are in favor of allowing oil exports is also quite impressive. These are people who we look to for leadership in a host of different areas. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal that I will ask be submitted as part of the record here today. This was penned by Leon Panetta and Stephen Hadley, the Defense Secretary in the Obama administration, as well as the National Security Advisor in the Bush administration. And they wrote a piece that was entitled, "The Oil Export Ban Harms National Security." Well-founded, well-written, to the point. It said directly, we keep this ban in place, this decades-old ban. It hurts us as a nation. It harms us from a national security perspective, not to mention the benefits that oil export will provide when it comes to increased production, increased jobs, benefit to our economy. There's other folks out there that have also weighed in. Larry Summers, who was formerly the Treasury Secretary for President Clinton. He was also the director of the National Economic Council for President Obama. And he said, and I quote, the merits on oil export, lifting the ban, the merits are as clear as the merits with respect to any significant public policy issue that I have ever encountered. This is a guy that many people look to for leadership in a host of different areas. Merits are as clear as anything on any issue that and public policy issue he's encountered. Tom Donilon, formerly the National Security Advisor to President Obama, has said that allowing exports will increase diversity of supply, increase competition, reduce volatility, and lower prices in global markets. The questions that we needed to ask about oil exports and should we lift this ban or not, the questions have been asked and answered favorably. Independent experts have studied what would happen if we lift the ban, and almost universally have encouraged us to move forward, lift this outdated, outmoded policy. This is not a partisan issue. My colleague from North Dakota is on the floor today. We've introduced bipartisan legislation to remove this ban. This, Mr. President, is simply something that is in the best interest of the United States, both in terms of our economic strength and in terms of our national security. I'm here today to tell our colleagues, to repeat and remind our colleagues that the time to legislate on oil exports is now. And the bill that we have in front of us, the National Defense Authorization Act, led by our friend and colleague from Arizona, I think is the perfect vehicle to advance this on. So, Mr. President, I would therefore ask unanimous consent to call up and make pending my amendment number 1594 related to crude oil exports. Okay. Mr. President, I will withhold the request to make this amendment pending at this point in time, but if I may proceed to just speak to the three quick components to the amendment. The first requires the Department of Energy to assess the impact that lifting sanctions on Iran would have on our global oil markets. We would likely see higher Iranian oil exports, even as American producers are prohibiting from accessing global markets. So our friends in Japan, in India, in South Korea, elsewhere, would continue importing from Iran, in part because they can't get the crude oil from us. They cannot import from us. And that situation is simply unacceptable. We would be lifting sanctions on Iranian oil while maintaining them on American oil. And I've said this, I've made this point, I've repeated it. By leaving in place the ban on oil exports on U.S. producers, while at the same time sanctions are relieved on Iranian producers, it effectively sanctions U.S. oil production. There was an article in Reuters this week that revealed that India is now importing record volumes of oil directly from Iran. Another from May showed record oil exports out of Iraq to global markets, and another shows the highest volumes of oil exports from Saudi Arabia in 10 years. So, Mr. President, the fact is we're simply not competing. So the second component of my amendment states that 30 days after completion of this report, then all U.S. crude oil may be exported on the same basis as the regulations and law currently allows for exports of petroleum products. Because today, we can export gasoline, we can export diesel, we can export jet fuel, really any refined product we can export without a license. But we can't export crude oil. It doesn't make sense, Mr. President, and it's high time that we resolve that inconsistency. So the third component of my amendment preserves the authorities of the President to block exports during emergencies, during a national security crisis, and so forth. So what we've done is we borrow language on these authorities directly from the legislation 20 years ago that authorized oil exports from Alaska's North Slope. This was a measure, it passed the Senate on a bipartisan vote, 74 to 25. It was signed into law by President Clinton. So what we had over 20 years ago was an overwhelmingly favorable vote well before this American energy renaissance began. The whole idea that oil exports would still be prohibited I find a little mind-boggling. The Commerce Department keeps a list of commodities that are in short supply, and they call this the short supply controls. And historically, these controls were not blanket prohibitions. They were on items like aluminum and copper, iron, steel scrap, diamond bore powder, nickel, selenium, polio vaccine, but not blanket prohibitions, just bits of them. The only items that remain on the short supply control list, there's 3 of them. One of them, you guessed it, is crude oil. The second is Western red cedar. And the third is horse meat for slaughter. Now, there's also a small caveat here that prohibits exports of petroleum products from the Naval Petroleum Reserves, but it really, the list is pretty short. There's 3 things. It's crude oil, it's Western cedar trees, and horse meat for slaughter. So clearly, Mr. President, our policy needs to be modernized. We see many parts of the world, it's just so volatile today. So many parts of the world are seemingly on fire. America and American energy needs to be ready to render vital assistance to our friends who are counting on us to demonstrate that global leadership. This is our chance, and I look forward to further discussion on the floor as we move this NDAA measure forward. But I would encourage colleagues to look at this amendment, look at the merits of the reports that have gone down in the past year, and look to updating this very outdated policy that is holding us back as a nation. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.